a moment, please, Darmir, a soft voice said from 2 places to my left. We looked at Christine, the oldest daughter of Lord Conrad, a noble knight and friend of my father's. She also was a young woman who found favor in my eyes and heart. I could spend the rest of the night describing her beauty, but, for the sake of the story being told, I shall save such for later. I've heard this story before, I think, she said. It's from the poems of the Romanicist Argentum. The knight in that story rode a unicorn, but otherwise it was the same, even to the two of them battling a dragon. Darmir gave her a knowing smile. "'Tis quite true, Christine. In fact, Argentum was a close friend of mine long ago. Mayhap I told him this tale, from which he wrote the poem of which you speak. No doubt the tavern name gave him the thought of a unicorn mount to suit the romantic mood of the poem. He was of that sort." The smile faded slightly. "However, you should not read so much the words, but rather the intent of such poems and stories. Therein lies the truth, and sometimes what lies closest to the heart." To my surprise, Darmir turned and winked at me. Christine, seeing him wink, smiled slightly, her cheeks blushing. At that point I discovered that not only had she won my heart, but I found favor in hers too. I returned her soft smile as Darmir continued his story. Chapter 3. Soon after the sky lost its rainbow colors, which occurred every morning when sunlight refracted from the many crystals forming the Crystal Mountains, Aleph reined in his horse. It was 5 days since he left the border of the great swamp, and another 3 since he saved the elf from her unwanted paramours. He was sure there was a quicker way out of the swamp than he took, but since he did not know the swamp very well, it took him longer to reach the Crystal Mountains. Dismounting at the foot of the sparkling mountains, he looked upward. He was not sure where the cavern he sought might be, only that it was around the towering peak. The climb did not look too difficult, so he surmised he could reach the peak in a few hours. After giving his mount enough rope to graze, he began climbing steadily. The cavern leading to the headwaters of the Crystal River was not a secret, but few dared enter the cold, fog-enshrouded entrance. Even fewer returned. After climbing for 2 hours, he paused to rest and think, his vision fixed on a large rock outcropping 200 yards above and to the right. So intent was his concentration on the outcropping, he failed to see the small animal hidden under the rocks where he next placed his foot. With a slight cry of pain, he cursed and drew back a leg that felt as if it were on fire. Looking down, he saw what he had feared. A brilliant red snake with brighter splotches of yellow coiled in a striking position. A fire snake. His sword swiftly cut through the loose rock and cleaved the 2.5-foot snake in half. Though his response was rapid, he was already too late. Poison fire crept up his leg. "Amazing how easy it is to miss such a brightly colored snake, isn't it?" the woman asked softly behind him. Aleph turned and saw an elf woman sitting on a nearby rock, her mouth turned upward in a smirk. Her exotic features caught him by surprise. Although he had first seen her face in Mirror Lake, and 8 nights before at the swamp, he was unprepared for the true beauty of her presence, augmented further by her revealing outfit. "Aye, lass, it is," he said through gritted teeth. "I was careless, paying attention to something else." He did not mention that she, too, caught him by surprise. She smiled and jumped down beside him. "You mean the rock beast behind that boulder?" She nodded upward toward the outcropping. He forced a returned smile. "You mean the 3 rock beasts, don't you?" He tried not to reveal the extent of the pain that was rapidly spreading upward in his leg. Had he poured lamp oil onto his leg and thrust it into the fire, it probably would have felt the same as what the venom did. The deadly snakes were aptly named. "Just testing," she said. "Well, I suppose I could help you with the poison. It wouldn't seem right to let you lie here and die in extreme pain. After all, your screams might cause a rock slide. You can't afford to be careless out here, you know. I suppose that comes with old age, doesn't it?" Aleph winced from the sarcastic comments, but mostly from the pain. as she drew a dagger and cut through his leather pant leg before tearing it open to expose the bite. She gently rested her hand on two dark red spots from which trailed equally dark red spider webs of inflammation. As she began her healing spell, Aleph said, "That it does, lass, but being surprised and outnumbered by 10 drunkards is far worse, methinks." Marist looked up abruptly. "That was you?" His dark eyes twinkled as he forced a smile. "One doesn't have to be old to be caught unaware, eh?" Frowning, she started binding his wound. "Nor to help one who deserves it." "As you say, lass." The burning pain subsided. "I take it you're here for the shirk-eyed arrowheads." She nodded, studying him for a moment before answering. "You wouldn't have asked had you not already known." Aleph tipped his head upward. "We can get past them together, or at least one of us can. What matters is that one of us sends a green arrowhead into the heart of that hell-spawned dragon." Marist adjusted her leather vest slightly, as if preparing for battle with Aleph rather than the beasts above. "I thought as much. How much are you being offered for its head?" she asked, angry at the unwelcome competition. Fire showed in her eyes. He slowly shook his head. "A peaceful rest for the dead is all the reward I seek from a dragon's death." "How noble," she said sarcastically. "Revenge for some lord's death? Perhaps your own crumbled castle?" He wore a grim expression as he looked deep into her eyes. "My children." She blinked, then nodded apologetically at the pain in his voice. "Sorry. Many have lost much to the dragon. You just seem like some errant knight who was out to feed his ego and his purse." Aleph ignored the comment. Perhaps at one time he would have. But he learned that lesson a lifetime ago, and at a cost that still haunted him. Instead, he looked at Marist's nearly full quiver. "I have but 2 arrows left. That leaves 1 rock beast for you." "Arrows against rock beasts?" she laughed. "What fantasy do you come from?" He smiled, because her statement was quite true. Rock beast hide was one of the toughest known, oft used for armor for those who could not afford plate. The creatures also had incredibly hard bone and muscle under that hide. For those who knew, however, there were other ways to kill one. "You do not aim for their heart," he explained. "Rather aim to open their eyes to the light." She nodded her understanding. "Some of these arrows are yours, by the way. With the shots you made that night, I shouldn't have to worry that you'll miss your target." "Actually, lass, that was the first time I've laid finger to bowstring for nearly 7 years." She raised an eyebrow and gave a faint smile, not sure if he was joking. "By the way, my name's Marist." He nodded curtly. "Aleph." She returned a nod. As stiff as he acted, she expected him to add "sir" or "lord" to his name. Perhaps he was not as noble, after all. When the pain from the snakebite subsided enough for Aleph to climb, the two quietly moved upward, bows in hand and arrows ready to fly. They neared a crystalline outcropping when a dark shape, the size of a large bear, shifted position, exposing itself slightly. Aleph nodded toward it without speaking. Suddenly a sharp roar announced the creature's charge. As the rock beast ran forward on 2 muscular hind legs, its dark brown fur sparkled, covered with crystal dust from its last meal. Huge paws rose to strike, each with steel-hard claws that could rend the hardest rock in the gravel and shred flesh like thin paper. The tooth-laden mouth, stretching from one side of the fearsome head to the other, dripped acidic saliva that the rock beast used to digest minerals. Each spattering saliva bubbled and smoked as it hit the ground. Although rock beasts subsisted mainly on the elements in the crystal rocks, the flesh of its opponents would just as easily slake its hunger as minerals. Unfortunately for the beast, Aleph pulled his bow back with steady strength and sighted down the wooden shaft. With the feathered fletching brushing his cheek, he released the arrow. It flew true to its mark, striking the creature's right eye and burying itself in the beast's small brain. The left paw made a spastic clutch of the air before the heavy body fell. As dust rolled from the dead beast's impact, the other two charged. Remaining calm, Aleph released his last arrow, and it struck home. Marist fired at the remaining beast, but the massive head dipped just enough that the arrow struck high on his brow and bounced, causing only an increase in the monster's charge. She frowned, throwing down her bow in disgust. She'd never missed a target before, and she had neither the time to think about why it happened, nor the time to nock another arrow. She raised her right hand, palm forward, as a blue-white crackle of electricity formed a halo around it. Clenching her hand into a fist for a moment, as though gathering power together, she thrust it toward the creature. A white-hot bolt of lightning struck the charging beast squarely in the chest. The rock beast roared as interlacing fingers of energy surrounded it, racking it with pain and fire. The mountain echoed with the death roars of the rock beast until the boat and its associated energy were spent. It fell to the ground smoldering a few paces from their position. Aleph turned a stern face toward Marist, who smiled broadly. He sheathed his half-drawn sword and continued climbing without a word. Marist's smile faded slowly at his lack of reaction. "I just learned that spell and had yet to use it," she said defensively. "I wanted to make sure it would work before I had any great need to find out." He stepped over to the still smoldering carcass. "It seems to work." Marist lightly kicked the heavy body and studied the dead creature, twitching her nose at the smell of seared fur. "I could definitely use an ale right now." She jumped forward to catch up to the man. After 3 hours, they saw faint white mist above. With a few more minutes of climbing, the two stopped before the mouth of a fog-enshrouded cavern. Even though they were several feet from the entrance, they felt the chill of the flowing white mist. "I've not felt such a chill since I battled a frost giant some years back in the Bathala Mountains," Aleph said, staring into the dense white gloom and shuddering in the cold air. Marist raised an eyebrow and gave a slight laugh. "Frost giants are nothing." He grimaced at her self-assured tone. "I'm sure they aren't to someone who has a fireball spell." Marist smiled slightly. In a tone of mock surprise, she asked, "Do I appear to be someone who would do such a thing?" Frowning, he ignored her humor, walking slowly forward into the fog, his hand on his sword hilt as he stared into the misty darkness. "I don't suppose you have a light spell or the like." "No." She was annoyed by his lack of humor. "We may be able to use those instead." He looked to where she pointed and saw 3 pine-fat torches lying on the ground near the cavern wall. He walked over to pick them up, seeing the remains of other burned torches scattered about. He picked up 2 others that were not that badly used. Marist came over to him. "I suppose someone left them here and forgot to pick them up." "Most like they never returned to do so." He handed one bundle to her. "Since we have no idea how far the cavern extends, it would be best if we burned only one at a time." She nodded, taking a torch in her hand. After lightly touching her left hand to the end of the wood, fire sprang to life. "I'll take the lead, you watch the back." She stepped into the cold mist before he could argue. Aleph frowned and followed her in. Within a few steps they were enveloped in a cold, dark mist, with the only light coming from the yellow firelight against the fog. Beyond the 5 feet of firelight, there was nothing but the darkness of deep underground, where no light existed but the one they brought. There was no sound save for the crackle of burning wood and the faint echo of their bootsteps. They walked for nearly an hour through the winding darkness of the cavern, as the temperature continued dropping. So far, there were no side channels or tunnels. Aleph kept his sword ready, knowing with their limited visibility they could at any time walk within reach of the most fearsome beast imaginable and never know it until it was too late. Slowly the fog began glowing white from another source of light ahead. Soon the mist thinned, and they no longer needed the torch as the light grew in brightness from sunlight entering the cavern through an opening. Whether needed or not, Marist kept the lit torch before her in case she needed it for a weapon. Her grip tightened when, in the brightening fog, she saw the shapes of shadowy figures. The fog cleared enough that they could see the light came through a large hole in the cavern roof. Sunlight shone through to reflect off the crystal clear water below, casting spots of sunlight about the walls, only to be reflected back in infinite directions from a combination of ice and crystals. Along the walls, giant icicles reached down like stalactites. As the two slowly crept forward, the shadowy shapes became clearer. Around the pool of water were many still figures of animals and humanoids. Aleph tightened his grip on his sword hilt as they cautiously approached the unmoving forms. When they were only a few feet away, they saw that the forms were creatures and men frozen solid in various states of motion. Some were frozen in fear, while others looked as though they were trying to escape an attacker. Yet others had weapons drawn as if to defend themselves. One was a dwarf miner, his rock hammer frozen in position as he tried to chip away a fist-sized sapphire crystal. Despite the poses, nearly all the frozen beings faced the water's edge. Though fewer in number, the animals lining the pool were in various poses, some in frozen panic, others looking as if they knew nothing of their immediate fate. A few were frozen in place as they drank from the water. It would seem the tale of these waters being cold enough to freeze someone is true. Maris' voice sounded disconcerted. Aleph looked around carefully, sword in hand. He half expected the frozen forms to return to unled life and attack. Aye, but it looks as though they were attacked by something. Maris nodded, walking cautiously to the well-dressed archer who had been attempting to flee from the water's edge. She reached to touch him, paused, and withdrew her hand, thinking better of the ideal. Yet I see nothing here. Perhaps some creature came from the opening. Aleph tipped his head in thought. The opening's large enough for a young white dragon to enter, but I don't see any signs that these individuals have been preyed upon. The opening, directly above the water, was indeed large enough for an airborne attacker, but even if the humanoids had been caught that way, the animals would not. Maris walked slowly to the water's edge and looked in. I don't see anything in the water, and it's as clear as the sky on a winter's morn. I can see the bottom as clearly as the rocks under my feet. I see even more than that. Aleph pointed at the cavern wall across the water. Maris saw 5 green shafts buried in the far wall just above the water's edge. The Shirkite arrowheads. Now we just have to get them. He studied the pool of water, stretching from rock wall on one side of the cavern to the rock wall on the other, both too smooth to gain a handhold. There was no way to reach the opposite side save by crossing the water. Maris propped her torch against a small rock as she came to the same conclusion Aleph had. Looks like I'll have to swim for 'em. She set her bow and quiver down next. Don't be daft, lass. You'll freeze solid as soon as your boot hits the water. Sword and daggers lay beside the bow. I have a spell to protect me from the cold. You protect me from anything else. His defensive tone pleased her. Maybe he was not so bad, after all. Maris smiled mischievously as she began removing her leather vest. Besides, she said with a slight laugh, I don't intend to get my boots wet. Aleph picked up 6 of her arrows and stuck them upright before him while placing one in his bow. Protect you I will, but what do you mean you won't get your boots wet? Leather landed on the sword, followed by her white linen top, which was the only thing covering the upper part of her body. She smiled, wondering what the chivalrous man thought as she continued undressing. What the devil are you doing, woman? He averted his eyes as her nearly naked body stood before him. She giggled at his embarrassment. My spell protects me from the cold, but not from getting wet. I'd like to have dry clothes to get back into. Besides, I hate getting my boots wet. She gave a slight, shameless laugh at his uncomfortable attitude. Don't tell me that a man your age has never seen a naked woman before. Aleph choked an answer, ignoring her comment about his age. Not one so willing to disrobe in front of a man without wanting money or being bonded in marriage to him. He looked at her, trying not to look at anything but her face, which was almost impossible. Still, in all honesty, I've not seen a match to you in beauty. Maris blushed slightly, feeling an unusual twinge of mild embarrassment. Thank you for the compliment. As long as you don't call me cute, you'll be alright. I'll take it that the man at the Flying Unicorn ignored such advice. Maris stared at him, completely unconcerned about standing before him, with only cold air around her body. I wondered about that. I thought you might just have been riding by that night, but you would not have known about my search for the Shirkite arrowheads if that were so. How did you find out about me?